Okay, let's get started. We are going to talk about sentence punctuation errors today. Now, a sentence is comprised of three parts. And when I say three parts, this is what I'm talking about. You have a subject plus a verb, and it equals a complete thought. And it has proper punctuation. So technically, it's four things. So here is an example of a sentence. We have a subject, which is a noun, pid. We have the verb, hate, and the direct object is English, but we have a period at the end. Now, when I say complete thought means that if you identify the subject, you can ask yourself, what is the subject doing? And it will point to the verb. If you ask yourself who is doing this action, it will point to the subject. And that makes it a complete thought. The fact that there is a period at the end, that equals a sentence. Okay? So I wanted to go over the infrastructure of sentence punctuation errors. So that moves us to clauses. There are two types of clauses. You have independent clauses and subordinate clauses. The other name of subordinate clause would be dependent clause. And so let's look at independent clauses. In order to have an independent clause, you have a subject plus a verb, and it equals a complete thought, much in the same description that I gave you for a sentence. And here's an example. Pid hates English, so we have a subject, verb, and as we've already discussed, it equals a complete thought. Subordinate clauses, on the other hand, they do have a subject and a verb. However, it does not equal a complete thought because it starts with a subordinate conjunction. And this is a word that, when used with an independent clause, it no longer can stand alone as a complete thought, as in the example we have here. Because Pid hates English. It can't stand alone as a complete thought. So therefore, anytime a subordinate conjunction, and in this case I call them wasabi words, and I'm going to give you an example of what wasabi words are later on in this lecture. So anytime you put a subordinate conjunction or a wasabi word in front of an independent clause, it becomes a dependent clause. All right, the next thing I want to discuss would be phrases. What is a phrase? Well, a phrase is a group of words that feels like they belong together. So what we have would be verb phrases, noun phrases, prepositional phrases, as in the case of the phrases you see here. Now, prepositional phrases come in different sizes and different denominations. They could be phrases that modify verbs. They could also be phrases that modify nouns. Depending on what that phrase is, determines what that phrase is doing in a sentence or a group of words. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about would be coordinating conjunctions. Coordinating conjunctions, most of you have heard of those in the form of fanboys. Now you have to remember, when you're using a conjunction as a coordinating conjunction, it is preceded by a comma. Now I have IC for independent clause, and so the format for a coordinating conjunction would be independent clause, comma, fanboy, independent clause. And if you're wondering what are fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. So in order for it to be a coordinating conjunction, you have an independent clause. I read or I read on the couch, comma, and I eat in the kitchen. So we have an independent clause, comma, independent clause, and that is how we identify coordinating conjunctions. All right, so in terms of dependent clauses, I promised I would go over wasabi words. So remember, anytime you have a subordinating conjunction in front of an independent clause, it becomes dependent. So the diagram we have here, independent clause, subordinating conjunction, now that becomes a dependent clause. So let me give you an example of that. Paul, that's my daughter's nickname, Paul likes school when she understands the content. So this portion of the sentence right here, we have a subordinate conjunction, and this independent clause becomes a dependent clause. So this is an example of the format I have up here. Independent clause, Paul likes school. Wasabi, that would be this word here, when. Dependent clause, this entire clause now is dependent because it can't stand alone as a complete thought when she understands the content. Okay, let's move on to the next diagram. And that would be dependent clause, comma, independent clause. Because she understands the content, comma, Paul likes school. So now we have the dependent clause first, followed by a comma, and the independent clause, Paul likes school. So just remember, anytime you start a sentence with a dependent clause first, you need a comma, followed by an independent clause, period, and we're okay. Below are the wasabi words. Wasabi is the acronym for the subordinate conjunction. When, even though, since, although, while, because, if, that, before, and after. Any of these words used in front of an independent clause will make that independent clause dependent. Okay? All right, let's move on. All right, so the first sentence punctuation error that I want to talk to you about is a comma splice. Excuse me. So a comma splice would be two independent clauses that are joined together with a comma. Paul likes school, comma, she understands the content. That is a no-no. We cannot join two independent clauses together with a comma. So if you ever do that, know that that is an error. Okay, so right now all I'm doing is identifying the 4 sentence punctuation errors. The next one I want you to recognize would be a run-on sentence. That would be 2 independent clauses joined together without proper punctuation. So the first is an example of 2 independent clauses that are joined together without any punctuation, and that's called a fused sentence. So we have Paul likes school. She understands the content. You see how they're just slammed together? That is a run-on. As opposed to the more classic format, Paul likes school and she understands the content. The fact that you have those 2 independent clauses joined together without proper punctuation, you have created a run-on. All right. The next error is a fragment. Now, remember we talked about the components of a sentence. Well, a phrase fragment is a group of words that's punctuated as a sentence that is missing either a subject or a verb or both. So we have an example where we have going to the store and we put a period at the end. Anytime you put a period at the end of a group of words, you are identifying that as a sentence, which means now the reader is looking for the subject and the verb. And if you don't have either one of those, or you have one of them is missing, or it's not a complete thought, then you have a fragment. Okay? The next error, and the last one, is a subordinate clause fragment. Once again, when you put a period at the end of a group of words, it has to convey a complete thought. It has to have a subject and a verb. Well, a subordinate clause fragment has a subject and a verb, but get this, it does not convey a complete thought. And if you look at the example I have for you, since Paul likes school, you see how that's dependent on something else for it to make sense? And the fact that it's dependent on something else for it to make sense makes that a subordinate clause fragment. Well, let's talk about how do we correct sentence punctuation errors. So I want to look at comma splices and run-ons first. Okay, so the first correction method for correcting run-ons and comma splices would be to use a period. Separate the 2 independent clauses with a period, and instead of having a comma splice or a run-on, you have 2 sentences that are punctuated perfectly. The next method to correct it would be to use a semicolon. So now we have Paul likes school, semicolon, she understands the content. So you can separate 2 independent clauses with a semicolon and you are fine. One of my favorite ways to separate independent clauses would be a semicolon and a conjunctive adverb. Paul likes school, however, she understands the content. I really want you to pay attention to this portion here. We have a semicolon, conjunctive adverb or transition, and a comma. If you forget that comma, it creates an awkward sentence, which is an error. Okay, so just make sure you have the comma before the independent clause. The next method would be to use a coordinating conjunction. We have Paul likes school, comma, for she understands the content. So we have independent clause, comma, independent clause. Well, it's independent clause, comma, fanboy, independent clause. Okay? And the last one is using the wasabi. So we have because she understands the content, that's our dependent clause, and we've identified our subordinate conjunction, comma, Paul likes school. Or we can have the independent clause first and the dependent clause can follow. She understands the content, that's the independent clause, since Paul likes school, and that's our dependent clause. So what I would do if I were you, I would memorize this diagram. Wasabi, DC, which is dependent clause, comma, independent clause, period, or IC, which is independent clause, followed by dependent clause, period. Okay? And those are the 5 methods for correcting run-ons or comma splices. In terms of fragments, let's deal with subordinate clause fragments first. So, looking at this sentence, while Duchess eats treats, Princess plays with her tail. So we can clearly see that this first sentence is a subordinate clause fragment. We have a dependent clause punctuated as a sentence. So to correct this error, we must remove the subordinate conjunction, and that leaves us with Duchess eats treats, period, Princess plays with her tail. The other method to correct it would simply be to connect the dependent clause to the nearby sentence, as in the example we have here. While Duchess eats treats, comma, Princess plays with her tail. Okay, so the question you're probably asking, Dr. Stovall, can I put the independent clause first and then have the dependent clause follow? Absolutely. Okay, just make sure that when you have the independent clause first, there's no punctuation between the independent clause and the dependent clause. All right, so let's look at what do we do when we have a phrase fragment. So I don't have all of the directions here. I'm just going to tell you what we have. Walking to class. Well, we know that that doesn't stand as a complete thought. Walking is a gerund. Anytime you have the name of an activity acting as a noun or the subject of a clause, it's called a gerund. So this first example would be if you have the phrase walking to class, add a subject and a verb. The student is walking to class, and therefore we have corrected that phrase fragment. The second method to correct a phrase fragment is to turn the phrase into a subject and add a predicate. So we have walking to class can be difficult if you cannot find the class. All right. And then lastly, I want to go over comma usage really quickly. So I have 1 minute. Let's see if I can do it. So the first method or the first reason to use a comma is if you're using a list. I like studying, reading, and knitting. Okay. The second reason to use a comma is an introductory phrase or a tag at the end. In the morning, comma, that's a prepositional phrase. In the morning, I drink coffee. The next one would be to use a comma for a coordinating conjunction or if you have a dependent clause, as in number 3. And the last one is when you have non-essential information. Send stuff tense. The smart kids, Darius and Precious, went home. We can remove Darius and Precious and we would have the smart kids went home. I hope this information helps you. Have a wonderful day. If you have questions, contact me.